Joining me now this morning to discuss the nascent movement in the Republican Party, national conservatism, is a conservative herself, Gabby Hoffman, who's joining us. Good morning, Gabby. Thank you so much for coming on the Wake Up America show today, and welcome to the show.
Austin, it's so wonderful to be on with you. I'm happy to break down this subject, and thanks for thinking that I have a big brain to deconstruct this. So I'm honored to be on, and congrats on the initial success you've had here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gabby. Glad to have you here. Yeah, for those who are just tuning in, we got our YouTube partner status today. So thanks to all of our listeners for helping to make that happen. Gabby and I go way back when I lived and worked in Washington, D.C. She's a conservative activist, and I've known her for a number of years. And her and I have been having conversations sort of behind the scenes about this new movement within the Republican Party. They call themselves National Conservatives. I call them NatCons for short. And they really are sort of the ascendant in the Republican Party, as the old neoconservatives have been pushed to the side and become what we call never Trumpers. National conservatism has risen to the forefront, and people are really excited about it. They're having conferences. Gabby, who are these people, and what would you say that they believe?
National conservatism is an interesting coalition that is starting to build. I would largely say that even though they're very loud on Twitter, they have yet to really take hold in electoral politics. But philosophically, they're starting to somewhat shape the conversation. But if some of your listeners are familiar with kind of the infighting or kind of the tussles in the conservative movement, we're not seeing something relatively new. We've seen this kind of infighting and battle between different factions for many, many years. This predated Reagan's time. This was happening after Reagan, and now this is happening post-Trump, if you can argue that. And so there's this kind of battle between, should we continue with the conservative fusionism that has worked to bring together libertarians, traditional conservatives, free market people, and people who support or who are against anti-communism? Or do we create something brand new because it's the failures of market conservatism or free enterprise that have brought about the problems, that have brought about the establishment? And so there's this kind of philosophical battle playing out. But a lot of people have kind of compared national conservatives, who tend to be economically progressive and socially conservative, which is kind of a minority faction that wasn't really influencing much. They were kind of loud. A lot of people have compared some strains of populism as national conservatism is built to kind of Pat Buchanan's thinking from the 90s, from the 80s and such. But it's an interesting kind of faction that is playing out. And even among populists, there is even some great disagreement. So I'm not sure how ascendant they really are. They certainly captivate a lot of people online, but it remains to be seen how influential they're going to be in the real world, because Twitter is not real life.
Yeah, that is true. If you're just tuning into the Wake Up America show, the Wake Up America show is real life. I'm speaking to Gabby Hoffman live on camera. We're glad to have her here. We're talking about the new national conservative movement in the Republican Party, how influential it may be. Now, you could say that, people speaking at their conferences, Ron DeSantis and many other figures who are ascended on the right, might be a sign of strength. And that's happening in the real world. There are conferences that are happening in the real world, Gabby. But I mean, would you say that Ron DeSantis kind of like throwing in Donald Trump, and others, who they kind of see as their avatar? Wouldn't you say that that would be a sign of a movement that's on the rise?
Some in media have said that his participation in the most recent NatCon conference in Miami could signal that he is sympathetic to tenets of national conservatism. Or maybe he has some friends of the organization and he did a favor for them and scratch my back, scratch your back. I'm not sure what to make of it, because if you look at how he's governed, I wouldn't say he's a national conservative, so to speak. He has certainly used the tools of government, state government, to kind of clamp down on Disney's tax kind of advantages that they enjoyed there. But if you look, I would say even beyond that, a lot of people see him as, I would say, a traditional conservative, just someone who uses his muscle a bit more. So I'm not sure if you can say he's exactly a national conservative. I haven't heard Ron DeSantis, for example, say that free market is producing these excesses, it's destroying the family. He's actually lowered taxes even beyond what Republicans have done historically in Florida. And I think you had tweeted this, that people aren't simply moving to Florida because he's fought Disney. And it's really interesting what's happening with Disney, another conversation for another time. because there's a leadership crisis there. But people were not moving to Florida. Like people I know, personally speaking, anecdotally speaking, who moved to Florida didn't say, well, I liked that DeSantis took on Disney, so I'm uprooting myself from New York or these other states, and I'm moving down south to Florida. Most people were seeking out Florida because it was not very restrictive with respect to COVID. They also were looking for a better tax system. They were very largely drawn to the no state income tax and lower tax culture overall that is often found in Florida. So I think that's what largely drew people there. So again, I think people can appear at conferences. He could give a nod or a wink to some of their stuff. I mean, his participation does give them legitimacy. That's certainly something to be argued. But is he truly emblematic of their movement? That remains to be seen, because I don't see him being anti-free markets. He's against cronyism. And I think something that NatCons unfortunately do is conflate true, pure, unadulterated free markets with cronyism. I don't see any conservative or even libertarian say we support the CCP. I think a lot of people have questioned whether or not we should engage with China in the future, and if decoupling can be seen as a free market kind of idea. And I think it can, because we shouldn't be necessarily giving license to an enemy state like that. And I think a lot of free marketeers believe that we perhaps contributed to their rise, but that doesn't mean you support tariffs or you support, undermining or undercutting the free market system. But it's just so interesting that in his actions, for instance, in DeSantis's actions, I don't really see populism, so to speak. Going against wokeism is also very popular among traditional conservatives and libertarians, as long as you're not, using, let's say, the hand of big government to do so. But fighting against the culture through statements and through exposing things is kind of a free market thing. It's an individualistic thing. He's not really using the government to say, we're going to undermine this through the purse of government. It's the wokesters exposing themselves in social media being helpful tools to give people access to their musings. So I think a lot of this can happen without government necessarily shaping and dictating. And it's also people voting in better representatives in Florida, for instance, who are combating wokeism, even on their own accord. So to his involvement can be understood as maybe giving license to them, but wouldn't categorize him as that, because he was part of the Freedom Caucus. He was for free markets as a member of Congress. So I don't really think it's a huge departure what he's doing. So it remains to be seen if a realignment really is happening and if it's being translated through Governor DeSantis or others like him.
If you're just tuning in to the Wake Up America show, I'm speaking to Gabby Hoffman. We're talking about the national conservative movement in the Republican Party, about zombie Reaganism, fusionism, and all of the ideas that are at issue within the current right-wing movement. If you have a question, you can send us a text at 573-319-1586. That's 573-319-1586. Now, Gabby, I know you consider yourself a conservative, right? And I would think of you more as a traditional type of a conservative from a philosophical perspective, small c conservative. And I'm more of a small L libertarian, traditional, libertarian, right? A classical liberal, if you will. But one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed as well, is that these national conservatives see libertarians as a much greater enemy than actual communists. And when I post that on Twitter, and I tweet that explicitly, people are like, what the hell are you talking about? They say that this, people don't believe me when I'm saying this one. And I mean, I can provide documentation to show, whether or not we're talking about Tucker Carlson embracing the economic platform of Elizabeth Warren, or whether or not we're talking about national conservative writers at the New Compact, embracing actual Chinese versions of communism because they claim it's pro-family, right? People still don't seem to believe it. But why do you think that national conservatives find libertarianism to be a bigger enemy or threat than they do Chinese communists?
I think it's largely a scapegoat. To blame someone for their own failures, they need to project their sins onto others. And I've learned over the years, I used to probably have very negative views of libertarians until I actually met some that were in the movement, that crossed paths with me. We fought battles. We worked together at Leadership Institute, or we worked together even beyond my time at Leadership Institute. And I think misunderstanding what libertarians are is a fault for them. And unfortunately, I see a lot of these national conservatives being former, and there's nothing wrong with having a political awakening, by no means, but a lot of them are former Bernie Sanders supporters. I've also seen some of these people from the Compact and other outlets praise FDR style government. And FDR style government continued the recession following the Great Depression, or rather, the Great Depression. It prolonged it by 7 to 8 years. He enhanced the size and scope of government. He created all these alphabet departments, and he is largely attributed to the public sector unions. He gave license to collective bargaining and so many other facets. We have a very empowered teachers union stemming from FDR policies and also emboldened by JFK, who allowed for collective bargaining through executive action, and then the Great Society afterwards. So FDR laid the groundwork for a lot of this wokester policy. So ideologically, it makes no sense to, hate libertarians more than you would FDR style politics. But it's super easy to blame libertarians for stuff. And I used to probably hold libertarians accountable. I think it was during the Cuccinelli election in Virginia. I was like, oh my gosh, it was these darn libertarians ruining it for conservatives. But I had seen the statistics afterwards that in exit polling, that it wasn't actually, the libertarian was kind of taking away both votes from both the Democrat and the Republican. And I understand it's easy to scapegoat Republicans for third party candidates, but there are times where there are no third party candidates and Republicans may lose even by a slim margin because some people see Democratic candidates more favorable, which is bizarre to me. But some people just vote like that. And I think they blame libertarians for the social ills, but a lot also can be faulted with the so-called, I wouldn't say they're all social conservatives, because social conservatives don't want the government to enact family policy. People see what happens when government becomes parental, and when it kind
Oh,
of
whoa, whoa,
enacts
whoa!
these
But
parental.
pause. I got to push back on that one. That has not been my experience with social conservatives, Gabby. Most social conservatives that I know think that it is the role of government to enforce their narrow worldviews. To me, a social conservative is someone who thinks that the government needs to get in bed with religion and needs to enforce their moral values at the point of a gun. We're having this discussion right now with the Respect for Marriage Act and the question of gay marriage, and from what I can see and understand, conservatives believe that gay marriage should be outlawed, and they're openly advocating for that. I mean, I guess you could say Twitter is not real life, but I mean, that's where many prominent conservatives go out there. If you're a social conservative and you don't think that the government should be outlawing what you find to be immoral, then you're really just a libertarian who has social conservative views.
I wouldn't call myself a libertarian, a social libertarian. I think also there's a debate among conservatives, two traditional ones. It's not because we agree with the David Frenches of the world or we want, let's say, to give concessions to libertines. I think a lot of traditional conservatives, even among social conservatives, you find debates and divisions. But I think most of us believe that the role of government should be limited. I think you've even seen a libertarian argument to say government should get out of marriage entirely. I've somewhat held that view myself, irrespective of some of the debates that are happening in Congress. But I think people remember, social conservatives remember too, largely thanks to fusionism, that when government acts as a parent, there are strings attached to that. And national conservatives have said, well, in order to encourage more family creation, we have to incentivize people getting married. It is hard enough to incentivize young men today to want to get married. They don't want to do it when they can freely choose to do it because they're afraid of it. And so could you imagine the government saying, you have to, by decree, now get married and produce? That's going to make people not want to get married even more, given the cultural challenges to that. So I think conservatives are very skeptical. Most conservatives, minus some of the NatCon variety, are very skeptical of governmental force being used to enact our policies. And David Harsanyi went on Dana Lash's show and talked exactly about this. And Dana Lash, as you know, is a very stalwart conservative. And she was saying the left already offers people benefits and these kind of perks through the government. Republicans are not going to take that away from them by offering kind of pro-family platitudes. So she was even warning against encouraging government one-size-fits-all policy to impose our will onto the people, because the economic populism, social conservatism view is maybe only 11% of the electorate. It's a really small faction. And most people are not going to say, you know what, I support lefty economics, but I'm going to go to social conservatism. That's not the case. Most
But
people.
isn't that fascinating though, Gabby? That you have all of these leftists who have brought their economic views with them into the Republican Party, but they're fiscally socialist and they're socially conservative, which really is the old FDR style of Democrats. I
Mhm.
mean, my grandparents, for example, who lived through the Great Depression. I mean, everybody was an FDR fan. It was World War II, so the United States was all sort of, they were all very much into into Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they all believed the propaganda because there were only 12 newspapers and 4 radio stations that they could hear at the time. Uh, but we now see that national conservatism really is it's like basically Bernie Sanders, but it goes to church on Sunday, as I like to say. But that absolutely drives them bonkers when I describe that. But do you think I'm being uncharitable?
I think that's a pretty reasonable take on it, because they, like I said, there was one NatCon conference, I think, earlier in the fall, and some of the people who profess to be Catholics were saying FDR style progressivism is acceptable. It could bring back Catholicism. And I come from a Catholic family, and most of my Catholic family members do not like FDR style politics and governmental style. They shrug against that because it discouraged that type of activity, and it heavily subsidized religion and kind of distorted it to a sense too. And people look back on the FDR years, minus him leading us through World War II. People certainly can give him that concession. The only policy aside from that was he actually put kind of true conservation at the model, creating wildlife agencies. That was one of the few policies I liked of his. But he enacted a lot of fiscal harm and rose taxes, and he, like I said, piloted a lot of these big government social programs that have really hurt a lot of different people, many demographics, many different individuals. And the reason why we have societal ills and kind of this
Right.
distortion of different things today is because of FDR policies.
It's
We see breakdown
not
of the
just
family.
FDR, not just FDR, but also his cousin Teddy Roosevelt. So
Yeah.
progressivism is not just a fixture of the left. There is a right-wing progressivism as
Hmm.
well, and that's very much the legacy that people like Josh Hawley, Josh Hammer, what's with these Joshes, and many other national conservatives, proudly tout. Is they ride the coattails of Teddy Roosevelt, and they say it's because they like him, his personality, but in reality, it's his fiscal policies that they aim to champion. If you really want to trigger people, and I'm here from the state of Missouri, tell them the fact that Josh Hawley voted for more government spending than Bernie Sanders. If you really want to blow their minds, I've got to go. Gabby, this was an awesome discussion and conversation. You should definitely become a regular on the show. We'd love to have you back every once in a while.
I should talk about freelancing with your audience, because there's a governmental rule being handed down. I know Missourians would probably be very fascinated, and those outside of Missouri. So I would love to come back on and chat about that when that rule is handed down.